I like to try to start at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Saturdays, every other Saturday. So 2 weeks from today would be our next one. Let me just double check and make sure that the stream is coming through. And it looks good. It looks good. So I think we're just about ready here to get started. Okay, good. Well, it is January 2nd, so Happy New Year. This is my first video for 2021. I'm excited to be launching into new and exciting topics for the year, and so I'm glad that you could join me. And for those of you who are watching it once it's archived up on my YouTube channel, feel free to pause and think about all the things that we're going to be talking about today. So what I'd like to start with is, this is a question that came from someone who listened to my last YouTube live series, which was how do different modes feel, and I talked all about, you know, the Ionian mode, Dorian mode, Phrygian mode, as well as some more unusual modes, and tried to talk a little bit about how they feel differently and how the modes work in terms of the intervallic makeup and how they feel. But I had a question that was a little bit different from that. So let me read it to you, and we're going to start here. So, all right, so let me see where to start. I stumbled on harmonic major chords. And again, just be careful. I mean, I think sometimes it's important. The most important thing is that you know what you're talking about. And after you've done that, you want to try to find the vocabulary that's kind of most universal amongst music theory people, so that you can communicate with other people. So when someone says something like harmonic major chords, not quite sure what that means. Does that mean harmonic refers to the vertical side of it? Are we talking about all the different kind of major chords? So major triads, major sevens, major minor sevens? Or are we talking about major as a key and all the diatonic major chords? So be careful with terminology. This is one of the tricky things, and it's particularly challenging because not every music theory textbook uses the same terminology. Not every music theory teacher uses the same terminology. So always try to find the most universal and try to be aware of as many different ways that people talk about music theory as possible. But let's keep reading. Furthermore, when I superimposed the harmonic major chords, seventh chords, progression onto their diatonic harmonic minor seventh chords, I noticed they formed extended 9 chords. So I think what we're talking about here is, we're talking about, let's say, C, E, G, B as a harmonic, what's being called a harmonic major chord, and then a harmonic minor chord, let's say E, G, B, D, and if you kind of put those two together, you get a C major 9 chord. So one major third, perfect fifth, major seventh, major 9. So I think that's what the question is asking about. Okay, and so where we're getting started. So in the key of A major, on the key of A major, I got these extended 7, 9, 11, and 13 chords, which led me to this discovery that then I write out the notes of a 13th chord. I can extrapolate 4 7th chords in one triad. For example, if I write out the notes of the 13th chord for F sharp natural minor, which is what I did right here, F sharp, A, C sharp, E, G sharp, B, D. I'm going to come back and talk about that D in a moment. Let me continue with the question. The writer is saying that I can extrapolate a 1 chord from this, a 3, 7. Now, when they wrote this question, they wrote 3 with a 7. I'd be careful to make sure that you indicate capital M7 to indicate that we're talking about a major 7. So, what are they saying? So here we got a root, third, fifth, 7, 9, 11, 13. Let me play this for you, because another important lesson for music theory is to not go too long just talking about the theory before you actually listen to what you're talking about, because it's easy to kind of just start talking in theoretical terms and not actually connect it to the sound. And remember, theory comes after the sound, in terms of explaining how music and sound works. So let's take a listen. Here we go. And if you listen to that chord, that's all from the, A major, F sharp relative minor. That is not a very good sounding chord. And in particular, the problem is this 13. Now, this is why I mentioned making sure you listen to stuff. Because theoretically, you say, oh, look, it's an F sharp minor 13 chord. The fact that you can explain it theoretically doesn't mean it sounds good. I would argue that it fits the natural minor, but stacking all of these up in thirds, it just doesn't sound very good. And the main reason for that is that this D creates a minor ninth with the C sharp. So the 5th and the 13 create this interval, which is just a very, very dissonant interval. And unless used very carefully, it's just unpleasant. I'm not saying you can't use it in a way that's effective musically, but you gotta be aware that it's so dissonant. And just in isolation, that doesn't really work. So what's interesting is if you were to make it a major 13, that does work. But that's not what the question is, and it would take us out of the natural minor. And I think the question is going into other areas. So what they're saying is look, out of this big F sharp minor 13 chord, I can get a 1 chord, F sharp, A, C sharp. That's absolutely true. They're saying, look, I can get a 3, and they didn't put the major sign, so make sure you do that, a 3 major 7, which would be, and I'll spell these out, right, so that we're all clear, right? So the 1 chord, F sharp, A, C sharp, and all those notes are within this F sharp minor 13 chord. A 3 major 7, A, C sharp, E, G sharp. That's all within this chord as well. But notice you have to say major 7, and the reason you do is I'm going to skip ahead and go to 7 major 7, 7, 7, 7, which is E, G sharp, B, D. That's a major minor 7. So if you put 3 7 and 7 7, this doesn't distinguish the fact that this one has a minor 7th, the 7 7, and the 3 has a major 7. So in order to distinguish the difference in the 7ths, you got to put a capital M before the 7. So keep that in mind. All right. So one of the good things about asking questions is sometimes even your question has mistakes in it. And that's important. That's part of the lesson, part of the learning process, is to ask a question and figure out how to word the question is half the battle. Certainly some of my students taking music theory class with me, I'll ask them, do you have any questions? And some of them just look at me blankly and I say, you don't even know what question to ask. You're confused. You don't even know what to ask, and they kind of nod. I'm like, well, okay, we got to roll up our sleeves and get to work here. But going back here to the minor 5 7, that would be C sharp, E, G sharp, B. And then finally a 2 diminished would be G sharp, B, D, and that's the top part of it. G sharp, B, D. Now, these are not all the chords you can extrapolate from this set of pitches, right? There's a lot other chords, like there's a 3 major triad. And like if you just say, where are all the possible triads? I got F sharp minor triad, A major triad, C sharp minor triad, E major triad, G sharp diminished triad. What are all the 7th chords I have? F sharp minor 7, A major 7, C sharp minor 7, E7. So you have a few more in there. So especially if you break out all the different triads, there's more than just the one minor 1 and 2 diminished. In terms of all the 7th chords, there's also a 1 7. You got the 3 7. You got the 5, and you got the 7 7. But they missed 1 7. They missed the 3 chord as a triad. They missed the 5 chord as a triad. They missed the flat 7 as a triad. So these are the other 4 chords, 1/7 chord and 3 more triads that are all included, all within this. And if you think about this, this is not a super mystery, right? Because in the, we've got 7 notes in the scale, and we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them right here. We got them all, right? That's it, right? There's no other notes, right? So if we're going F sharp minor, we've got F sharp, G sharp, A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp. Of course, you're going to be able to get all the notes, all the diatonic chords out of a 13th chord. Any 13th chord gives you all the, you got all the pitches, all the diatonic pitches. Now, it doesn't, in a minor key, it doesn't allow you, this doesn't give you when you would raise the leading tone, but it gives you everything diatonically. So here's where the question gets particularly interesting and why I wanted to include it. This discovery with extended diatonic chords has opened up a wormhole of cool jazz and R&B voice leading possibilities. Can you please cover or explain why this is possible and give examples how a composer or songwriter can use this to his or her advantage? So yeah, especially in a cool jazz or R&B, which is really drawing upon these extended 7th chords. And where did they get them? They got them from the French composers like Debussy. So if we look at that lineage of Claude Debussy, French impressionistic music at like around the 1900s, and then we go to cool jazz, which is in the 1950s pretty much, and then R&B, which again, they're all drawing upon a similar harmonic language that's rich in 7th chords, 9th chords, 11th chords, and 13th chords. The reason all this works is because the chord itself contains all the notes in the scale, right? So if I reorder them, right, so that, let's say I don't really want that, as I mentioned, that 13th that was a little bit dissonant. Let's say I start. Let's say what's usually going to be more commonly used by a composer and songwriters, instead of using all 7, they're going to use 6 of them. And the reason you use the 6 is to avoid that one minor 9th interval. It's just not a great interval. So if you start on, let's say, F sharp, and then you can just move. Let's say you go. And so they use a lot of parallelism where everything just shifts up, which is not what you would use for, your Bach, Beethoven, Mozart style of music, but parallelism can sound really pretty. And even when you have that minor 9th interval, if you're moving things up and down parallel, it kind of can disguise it, because the scalar motion of all these chords, so this has the minor 9th. I'm like on a C sharp minor 11 chord there. But if you don't start on a chord that has that minor 9th very prominently featured, you can slip through it, and the power of the scale, the human ear starts hearing it in a context that makes it understandable. So to get into that, like, how does cool jazz, how's R&B, how would you use this? One, you would plane the chords, so parallel motion. So you probably would, instead of using 7 notes, you would probably use 6 notes. So that would be step 1. So let me just erase and give you a kind of like a little checklist for those of you who want to explore this. So use it as a 6-note chord. It's going to be sound a little bit better. That's one option. 2, parallelism. Just going up and down diatonically. Because what you're doing here is you're not really talking about harmonic function. You're basically taking the scale and using that as a colorful palette. And it kind of shifts, almost like a kaleidoscope. And that's a different impression. You just get these pretty sounds that kind of shift colors and the way it kind of hits the ear. So that parallelism. Another option where you go into where composers will use kind of all the notes in the scale is to, instead of using tertial harmony, right? So this is tertial. Tertial means you're stacking your chord in thirds, stacked thirds. But you can do other things like quintal. So stacked fifths. So people like Aaron Copland would do something like that, where instead of going like this, you might hear and you have all these big open fifth sounds. And so you might, and you probably wouldn't, you know, maybe you would start on, you start on like an E here if we're in the with three sharps, because you don't get that tritone, which is kind of like the same minor ninth issue that we were discussing earlier. You don't get it until later on. And you could even move it down if you started on, let's say, the D. There you then the tritone happens to get back to the root. So let me show you how that would look, and I'll write it out. So this is the same notes as this F sharp minor 13, but I'm gonna extend the staff down here so I can write some bass clef notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is my bass clef now, and I'm going to start down here on. Let's go D down here. D, A, E, B, F sharp, C sharp, G sharp. Right. So my D from up here. And I'll use to show you where it ever goes. So this is all those notes, right? So the D goes down here. The A goes here. The C sharp, that stays where it is. The E jumps down here. The G sharp stays where it is. And the B jumps here. So we got all the same pitches as that F sharp minor 13. But they're just spaced out differently. So instead of this, which is a tertial harmony, we get this, which is stacked in fifths. The reason this works is because it's giving you all the diatonic notes, and it's just establishing a system on how those notes are going to relate to each other. Are they going to relate by thirds? Are they going to relate by fifths? Typically what happens is that means is it feels like you're just shifting what note, the exact intervals, by shifting up or down a step and just keeping that intervallic makeup. So I hope that helps, and it gives you something to experiment with in terms of different harmonies, and it is particularly good in cool jazz and R&B. So good. Let me just take a quick look here at my chat before I go into my next question. I'm not going to take questions quite yet. I have another one that I want to chat with you about. As you can see, I have something already put up here on the board. We've got someone wishing me Happy New Year. I appreciate that. All right, people tuning in. A question about inverse arpeggios. I'm not quite sure what that terminology means. Kind of back what we were saying. So if you could give me an example of what an inverse arpeggio would be. Are we just talking about going down an arpeggio instead of going up? So maybe in the chat, give me an example with some pitches, and I can talk some more about that. Gabby, hey Gabby, this is, I think, your question that's coming up. Life of Brian, Happy New Year to you as well. Got questions about my educational background. All right, all right. So good. Let me, since I mentioned Gabby, I think this is, Gabby is one of my supporters on Patreon and had this question. And I'm going to read it to you in a second, and I wrote some stuff up here. But I'm going to title this part of the video Augmented 6 Madness, because there's so many things you could do with Augmented 6 chords, and we're just starting to get pretty deep into it. Okay, so Gabby mentioned that she finally managed to go through all my lecture videos, and there's 47 of them in order. And so some of the stuff we'll be talking about, if you haven't gone through those 47 videos, some of this might go over your head. You might not understand everything, which is okay. You should keep watching. You'll at least have a better idea of the questions, but you're going to get a lot. You definitely want to go through all 47, or make sure you have the knowledge that's covered in those 47 videos to fully get the most out of what we're talking about, like today. So she asks, can I chain different types of augmented 6 chords, or even N6, which is Neapolitan 6, with an augmented 6 chord somehow? So this is, I'm going to do a little translation. So the first part of the question is, can I chain different types of augmented 6 chords? So here's, I think I understand the question, but let me give you the options. When you talk about different types of augmented 6 chords, are you referring to the different types as Italian, French, and German? Because you could say these are 3 different types of augmented 6 chords. Or are you talking about augmented 6 of scale degree 5 versus augmented 6 of scale degree 4, or augmented 6 of scale degree 1, or is etc. There's more options, right? There's more options here. So are you saying that the different types of augmented 6 chords are the Italian, French, German variety, or are you saying different types of augmented 6s, meaning the type referring to what scale degree it's resolving to? So I'll answer both sides of that question, right? So if you're talking about how you would change, I assume you're talking about this, the augmented 6 chords going to a different scale degree. Because you wouldn't, if it were Italian, French, or German, you simply could change that type of augmented 6 chord within that chord, or within that time. So you could start off with an Italian, then you could say, turn it to a French, German, and then right? So how would you chain them? Well, you would probably go from most consonant to more dissonant, right? So the Italian really just has the 3 different pitches, and the French and the German have 4 pitches. So you would probably start with the Italian if you're looking to chain these different types. And if you did the Italian, you could, the reason I went Italian to French, because then I'm getting, and then German, I get this scale. You could also conceivably go, right? So one voice would either be going, so Italian, French, German, or Italian, German, French. So if we're in this key, let me do it so it lines up. There's my Italian, German, French. There's your 1 chord. So how would you chain them? I would probably start with the Italian, move to either the French or the German. My first choice would be the French because the power of the scale. going from that, in this case, I was doing it in the key of C major, so it would be C to a D to an E flat. But I'm assuming that's not what you were talking about. And even if it was, this, I think, is actually far more interesting. So let's talk about how you would chain a bunch of augmented 6 chords that go to different scale degrees. The most common is augmented 6 of scale degree 5. It's so common that you usually don't, if you just write Italian, French, or German augmented 6 chord, and you just don't put anything like the slash with the scale degree here, it's assumed that it's going to scale degree 5. That's the assumption. If you want it to be going anywhere else, you have to indicate that. Now, for those of you who need a little refresher on augmented 6 chords, obviously I've got a couple videos up in my lessons, but let's give that refresher right now. Okay? So with augmented 6 chords, they're really, it's like a voice leading concept more than a chord. So when we say augmented 6 chords, the word chords is a little misleading. What we really are talking about, and I'm doing everything in the key of C major, is you really think about what the goal is. So the goal is an octave. Let's say this octave is a G. You have a note a half step above. You have a note a half step below. This is the critical motion. If you look at what is the interval, A flat to F sharp, A, B, C, D, E, F. It's a 6. A 6 of what kind? When you do the theory, it is an augmented 6. A flat, normally you would expect to have an F natural in the A flat major scale, so A flat to F would be a major 6. Therefore, by raising it to an F sharp, you get an augmented 6. That's where the whole name for augmented 6 chords comes from, but they resolve like this, right? F sharp goes up, A flat goes down. The only other note that's always added is which would be a C. In this case, whatever would be a note a third above this note that goes down. All right, so this is your core voicing of an augmented 6 chord. This is, if you just have this, it's an Italian augmented 6. And the way I remember this is that the Italians really, really love melody. They love their opera diva, their singer. So they're going to just use the bare bones for the harmony, right? They're not going to have any extra notes. So they just use the 3, which is different than the 4 notes that are used by the French and the German, who like their harmony a little bit more. This is a generalization. It's not always true. But but these kind of like generalizations have a basis in reality. So that would be your Italian augmented 6. And again, let me say it again, because it's so important, it's the voice leading that matters. Like, you can't just be like, here's a mistake a lot of people will make. And I'll show it to you in a moment. So after you do that, if what we do is we then say, okay, we're going to add E flat. That turns it into our German augmented 6 chord. So we're just adding another note. Here's the mistake people will make. People say A flat, C, E flat, F sharp. Well, F sharp is really enharmonically the same thing as G flat. So, Dr. B, isn't this just an A flat 7? The answer is no, it's not. Because in a 7th chord, the G flat, the 7th of the chord, must resolve down. It would resolve down to an F normally. And if that was not a possibility, it might resolve down to, let's say, F flat, which would be another option, right? Or it would maintain and then eventually resolve down to some kind of F. That's the way the voice leading works. This isn't doing that. This has a different tendency. This is actually, it's not a G flat that resolves down. It's an F sharp that resolves up. So the way it moves is differently, which means it's going to feel differently. It's not going to feel like a 7th chord. So, and then finally, if we want to talk about, and we should, the French would have a D. It would be A flat, C, D, F sharp. And that D would turn it into a French augmented 6. Now here's how I remember the difference between the German and the French. The German augmented six has A flat, C, E flat. That's a very like full, rich triadic harmony, and then has the F sharp. So it's got this full, rich harmony. German tends to be very robust. Think about a German dark beer. It's big, it's heavy, it's got that power, it's got that full major triad, the perfect fifth. The French, however, A flat, C, D, F sharp, you have a tritone between the A flat and the D. You have a tritone between the C and the F sharp. It's like very quirky, it's very peculiar, it's very colorful, which is something that's often associated with French culture, French music. Well, you'll have these, like think Cirque du Soleil. It's a little bit strange, but it's very cool. And so that's how you kind of remember the different augmented six chords. Now, this formula of half step above the target note, half step below the target note, you can change what that target note is. Typically in music, that target note, the most common one that composers have used historically, that target note was scale degree 5 of the key. So if we're in the key of C major, we'd expect it to go to a 5 chord, or at least have those notes resolved to those two Gs. Sometimes instead of the 5 chord, you could have instead a 1-6-4 chord, which has the G and the G in the key of C, just like we'd expect. So 5 or possibly 1-6-4. That would be your most common target. But you can take that same thing and have different targets. And I think this is, when you want to talk about chaining augmented six chords, this is where it gets really interesting. So listen to this. That's the A flat, C, F sharp. And that's where we'd expect it to resolve. Now if we say, well, let's just use our parallelism and scale to see what happens. That's to 4. So just listen to those two. That sounds really cool. Why does it work? Well, many, many reasons. One, you have this bass. The power of the scale can never be underestimated. This descending chromatic scale. And in the case with the bass and the tenor, you've got descending chromatic parallel thirds, and you've got this pattern above. So you can start chaining them by going to the 5 chord, then to the 4 chord, and we could just keep that chain going. Now the chain loses a little bit of its exact pattern because a couple of things change. Your target notes with 5 and 4 are both major triads. When we go to 3 and 2, our target notes are now minor. So the interval relationship changes. And also, between 4 and 3 is just a half step, whereas here it's a whole step. So what would happen is, let's see if I wrote out how that chain would continue and how it would change. So now to go to augmented 6 of 3, the bass stays the same, which is why I have this red bracket. The third above that stays the same, another bracket. And then we jump down to the D sharp. And now, this step here is a whole step instead of a half step between that third above the bass. And if we continue, that means that note has to stay the same, that third above the bass. So you see that in this first measure, which is, again, our most traditional augmented 6, going to scale degree 5, followed by another one, which is a whole step away and allows for the whole pattern to be exactly the same. It's different than when we're going to minor triads. Then the pattern kind of changes a little bit. We have down a whole step, common tone, down a whole step. So if we just listen to the minor part, that part, stays the same. So we almost have like 2 variations of this chain. The one that goes to major triads, and then the one that goes to minor triads. And then if we're going to actually finish and get back to 1, so I think that's a wonderful chain. of augmented sixth chords. Let me play it for you one last time. You got the idea of a sequence where you have this repeating pattern and the power of the scale. And between the two of them, you're chaining these augmented sixth chords. And it's not augmented sixth chord to augmented sixth chord. It's augmented sixth chord to its resolution. So the real pattern, it's more like a sequence, right? Is those two chords together. It's like that block of augmented sixth chord resolving to where it should go, then chaining it to another pattern of those two. Now, if we were to skip those, and I haven't tried this, but I think it would sound, I don't know if it would work. Let's just... Right? So I just played the augmented sixth chords there. So I'm in this key. That's not as bad as I thought it would be. It's pretty unusual, and it definitely feels like if you were composing something and you want it to start feeling like, whoa, we're on slippery ice, or I'm just fell off of something. You know, if I was writing a score for a movie or a video game and someone just like fell and they're like trying to learn how to fly, I might just play augmented six of 5, augmented six of 4, augmented six of 3, augmented six of 2, and it just has this falling motion. And then when you finally come out of it with the resolution of 1, then you can, oh, finally, like you either, you know, you learn how to fly and you pull up out of the free fall. So you could do it that way. Now there's a couple other variations that I think are worth talking about. So let's say this pattern would work with either the Italian or the French augmented six. And the reason is that when you have a German augmented six, you can't go straight to a root position triad. The voice leading does not work. Let me show you. Let me show you. So if this was a German augmented six, our first chord would be A flat, C, E flat, F sharp. F sharp would go up to the G, the A flat would go down to the G, the C would go down to a B, and normally you'd want the E flat to go to D, but the problem is A flat, E flat, G, D, those are both perfect fifths, and you would have parallel fifths, which, you know, is just not something that you typically find in traditional music theory. It's not that it sounds bad, it just doesn't sound like 4-part harmony. So that's what it would be. So if you're saying, listen, I don't care about that, I don't mind that it sounds a little blockier, you could do that. But if you're trying to go for the more Beethoven, Brahms type of harmonies, what you typically do is instead of going from the, let's say, the German augmented 6 to 5, you don't do that. You go to 1, 6, 4, then 5. So it would be C, the E flat would go to the E natural, and then the C would go down to B, and the E would go to D. So you'd have this as your motion. So you'd go, I'm sorry. Now, let's modify this chain and see what that would be like. We'd go 1, 6, 4, 5. And here we would go to, this would be flat 7 we would go to, because the way the motion would work, you would need to keep that common tone. So that's kind of interesting, going to flat 7 to 4. And then this is our augmented 6 of 3. This would be a minor 6 in second inversion to 3. And this would be a minor 5 chord to 2. So if we look and see how these would change, this 5 chord would turn into a 1-6-4 to 5. The 4 would turn into a flat 7, 6-4 to 4. This 3 would turn into a minor 5, 6-4 to 3. I think I'm doing this right. Let me double check myself. And this would be a 6, 6-4 to 2. Let me double check. Here we go. I did this one wrong. This is my 6, 6-4. So this is 6, 6-4. It's because and this would be my 5, 6-4. Last one here on the 1 chord would turn into a 4-6-4 to 1. So that's how you would modify that if you wanted to use a German augmented 6 chord. But wait, there's more. What if you instead wanted to actually follow a traditional harmonic progression? Because 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. This is not a harmonic progression. That's just a kind of parallel progression. So, you know, you can do it as a sequence. It works, but it doesn't have that same effect. So let's say instead you wanted to do an actual progression, like let's say circle of fifths progression, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. Let's say that was your progression. So let me put some staves up here on the board. And again, this is all kind of things that you know, composers use these augmented 6 chords. They use them in all sorts of different ways. And chaining, you know, just like chaining, composers will chain suspensions. They'll chain secondary dominants. This is a way that you can experiment with chaining augmented 6 chords. So we're going to keep ourselves in C major. And we're going to say 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. All right. So if we do that, and we're just going to write in E. Actually, let's just put our bass line in E, A, D, G, C. Let's put our augmented 6. We're going to put an augmented 6 before each one of these. So think about how you would spell it and see if you can spell it as fast as I can. All right, so if E is our bass, that means F is going to be our here, and we're going to have a, do I want to do it all in one octave? Let's do it up high. D sharp goes to E. So if we voice the rest of this chord, let's put the A here. Let's make them Italian augmented 6. You always double that third above that bass note. And if we do that, then we could say this goes up to the B, this goes to a G. And that could be our resolution, right? Now, augmented 6 of 6. We would have B flat here. We would want to have a G sharp somewhere. So let's look at, we have a G. I always want to try to go for smooth voice leading. So let's see what happens when we put the G sharp here and go to the A here. then we want A, and so then if we complete this B flat G sharp, we know we need a D. D, the closest D is right there. We want another D, so let's put it there. We have a little bit of a leap. Let me make that a little bit cleaner. Not too big, a leap of a third. And then if we go to our sixth chord, which is the A minor triad, we need E and C. Since this leaped up, we're going to step back down. Then we need an augmented sixth of 2, which means that we're going to jump to an E flat here. We're going to need a C sharp. There's a C right here, so let's turn that to our C sharp. That will move to our D. Again, I'm just doing a voice leading thing. I need a G. I need 2 Gs, so I'll put a G here and a G here. We know this G is going to step back. It's part of that formula that we do. And this G is going to step up. It becomes a pattern. It becomes a sequence. And if we have augmented sixth of 5, that means we've got an A flat here. We need a F sharp somewhere. Well, there's an F sharp right up here in the soprano. This will move up to our G. We will then need 2 Cs. So let's put a C here and a C here. This C is going to step back to B. This C will step up to D. And then if we're going to resolve this thing, let's say we go to E here, just keep the G, keep the C, like that. So let's see what this would sound like. This is kind of using that same idea we did before, but to go on an actual traditional progression. My hands aren't big enough. Let me jump some things up the octave. So I'm going to put this up here, B flat, to the A here, and this will go A flat, G. So I'm going to jump these up the octave so that I can actually play it. Oh, that sounds a little strange. Because it goes, I would probably voice lead that differently. It's so I would have to play around with this to get the voice leading right. So this is the only thing that really bothers me, this D to E, because we had this happen already. We had this D sharp to E, and then to go to D to E seems a little awkward. All the other things, none of the other voices kind of do that prominently in the soprano. So it's kind of like when you have hidden fifths or hidden octaves, there's certain rules that the soprano, because of its prominence, makes things have to be a little bit different. But the idea of like, okay, you could play around with this and say, okay, I'm going to come up with a different voicing so that I don't have to have that be in the soprano. But I think that gives you some good ideas on how you could chain that. My very last, well, not my last part. Another way you could try to chain augmented sixth chords is to shift them from being augmented sixth chords to being major, minor, dominant chords, probably secondary dominant chords. So if you remember, I said a seventh chord resolves differently than an augmented sixth chord. So if we have, in the key of C major, we have this augmented sixth of scale degree 5. If we kind of like a pivot chord, almost thinking of it like a pivot chord, call it a 5, 7 of flat 2. You're in the same key. It's just like a pivot. It's just, instead of resolving it the way you'd expect, you're going to resolve it a different way. You could then start chaining things into different directions. You could then go to like N6 right there. So you could chain yourself that way, because this would go, N6 is another basically flat 2 in first inversion. So part of the other question that Gabby asked is, could you even do N6 with an augmented 6 chord? And you could basically treat that augmented 6 chord as a 7th chord, as a secondary dominant, and go right into there, which would sound like this. The other thing you could do is you can reverse that. You can actually treat it like an augmented 6 chord. If you did treat it like an augmented 6 chord, you could go this direction, where you get let's see, we start. And let me quickly, and this will be the last augmented 6 one I do, so I can get to your questions, but I just wanted to be as thorough as possible, and that's why I called it Augmented 6 Madness, because there are so many permutations, and we haven't even talked about it's essentially like putting augmented 6 chords in an inversion. So instead of having the half step above go down and the half step above go up, you can swap the orders of that and just have the voice leading move that way. It's not, again, since it's not exactly a chord, you don't necessarily always call it, an inversion, but it's kind of similar. So we didn't even talk about those possibilities. So Augmented 6 Madness can continue on your own as you continue to explore all permutation and options. But let's say we're in C major, we're going with an N6, which is a flat 2 chord in first inversion, which means we have an F. Let's say we have, let's put our D flat here, F, A flat, like that. And then we're going to go to an augmented 6 of scale degree 5. I'm going to call it Italian augmented 6 to be specific. Actually, I did that incorrectly. So let me see, there's a couple different voice leading options here. I did not write this correctly. I did not write this correctly. Don't worry, folks. I'll catch it. Let's see if this works. We've got that does work. That tenor is a little funky. You see a D flat C, D natural. If that was the melody, it would be kind of too awkward, but hidden in the inner voice is exactly where it belongs. So we're here in the key of C major. Here we come. That's 1, 4, Neapolitan 6, augmented 6 of 5, Italian augmented 6. And just think, you might want a different melodic contour, melodic shape. Like I particularly love this F sharp G line. So if I wanted to emphasize that, what I might do is figure out a way to drop some of these other notes. So instead of having So I would have the F down here to the A flat to the G. I would put, this would become my soprano. I'd put my D flat, C, D natural here, and I'd have my A flat, C. I would double that note like that. So this would make it sound like you can pull that whole bass note up the octave as well. There's no need for it to be that low. So I think that is probably the strongest melodically. So that's a way that you could connect, you could chain a Neapolitan 6 to an augmented 6 chord. It would sound really good. Gabby had a second part to her question, but this one is really quick. She asked, can I apply the second dominant function to any borrowed chord apart from 3 augmented and diminished ones? That's correct. You can't do a secondary function to anything other than a major or minor triad. So she then says, so in C major, would the following work? C to B flat major to E flat major to A minor. And notices and writes, the A minor sounds odd here, unfortunately, but A flat would sound fine. You're absolutely right. So C, B flat, E flat, A does not work. You can put a secondary function in front of any borrowed chord. You just got to remember that it's perfect fifths. You know, it's down a perfect fifth. So when you go, if you're saying I have a C major triad, this is my 1 chord, and I'm going to borrow 3 from the minor key. Okay, we're in C major here. Let's say C major. And then you're going to go to your regular 6 chord. Let's say A minor. So the secondary function to this would be a B flat major triad, and that works fine. But the secondary function of the A minor would not be E flat. So you would actually have an E triad of some kind, right? So the E flat doesn't go, right? So if you're chaining stuff, you gotta like sit down and go nice and slow and say, okay, which ones are my chords? Which are my borrowed chords, and which are my secondary function of said borrowed chords. So, you know, you could say the B flat is a borrowed chord. You could say the E flat's a borrowed chord. You definitely can't say the A minor is a borrowed chord. So the only one that really makes a ton of sense was this in the example being asked. So this will not work, E flat to A minor. But if you wanted to then turn it into E dominant, you know, you might have something. It's going to be a little unusual. Let's say you go. And I would go from E flat major to an E7 so that I could, so that to the 2 E flats don't have to go to 2 E's and have parallel octaves. So anyways, lots of exciting things. I hope I didn't go too far afield in answering those questions, but lots of things to think about. So let me turn now to the chat and answer some of the questions there. So someone's asking me, what college did I get my undergrad, grad, and PhD? So I'm happy to share that information, and I went to Ithaca College. I applied to 3 different colleges. This is the only one I got into, mainly because I didn't know what I was doing. So I applied to one college, and I went there and I did my audition. I played a jazz piece and I played a classical piece. I came out of the audition, and the person says, oh, I'm going to take you to your jazz audition now. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I just played everything. Like, oh no, that was your classical audition. Now's your jazz audition. I had no clue that I had 2 auditions. So I went to the jazz audition. I played. The jazz person that asked me how I did, I said, well, I think I did okay, but I didn't realize, so I played everything. And he just started laughing at me. And I played in my jazz audition, and he said, oh, if it's up to me, you're in. I didn't get in. So the classical folks, I didn't play enough of the classical stuff for them to hear, and I didn't know what I was doing. So I didn't get in there. I applied to Eastman School of Music, which is in Rochester, New York. And I didn't realize that Eastman School of Music had a whole separate application process other than the University of Rochester, which is like the umbrella institution that houses Eastman School of Music. So I applied to the wrong college. And so Ithaca College was the only one I got into of the 3 I applied. Now, I have to say, I really got a lot out of Ithaca College. I was a little bit of a stinker when I went in there because all I wanted to do was play jazz, soprano, saxophone. And I get into my first saxophone lesson, and my teacher goes to me, well, I don't teach jazz, so you're going to have to take classical. And I'm like thinking to myself, man, what do I drop out of school now? And I'm like, fine, whatever, I'll play classical saxophone. The irony is I play more classical saxophone right now at this stage of my career than jazz. I mean, who knows? Like next year I might be playing more jazz saxophone again. I love both, but at that time I was not pleased. But I was so well prepared with such a strong foundation that it allowed me to go in so many different directions in terms of my career. I found that I was just really well prepared in terms of theory, ear training, history, classical music, jazz music. I really had a really well-rounded education. So very positive experience there. I then went to New York University in Manhattan because I wanted to be a jazz musician. So I was like, I want to be in New York City. And since I'm here and I don't know anybody, I might as well get a master's degree. That was my thinking. And I went to New York University. I studied with phenomenal people, some really great players. But it was crazy expensive. And like space was at a premium. Like you couldn't always get a practice room. There was just so few practice rooms, and it was so expensive that it's like that one's like I really have mixed feelings on New York University in terms of did I get a value for what I was spending? Certainly being in New York, which was my primary goal, that panned out. So all said and done, New York University is Manhattan. That alone is extremely valuable. And then I went to Rutgers University, which is in New Jersey. And it's the Mason Gross School of the Arts. And I got not a PhD. So PhD, these are for like your more academic music classes, like disciplines like history or theory. I got what's called a DMA, which is short for Doctor of Musical Arts. And that was because I went for a performance degree. That said, I still had to take graduate theory, graduate history. I still had those requirements in those classes. I just didn't have as many of them as if I was going in the PhD program for theory or for history. So what was nice about the Doctor of Musical Arts for me is that I got to focus on performance, which has always been my first love, but I still got to get some of that in-depth music history, music theory, and things like that. So that's my educational background. And I ended up also getting a teaching certification. So I went to St. Peter's College, which is also in New Jersey. This is all in the United States. And this was specifically for education. Because a girlfriend at that time got a phone call saying, would you like to teach high school? The year's already started. And she was like, I don't want to do it. And was like, Chris, do you want to do it? And I was kind of clueless. And I said, well, I'm just playing gigs at night. I'm not doing anything during the day. Yeah, sure, why not? Why don't I teach some high school? Not realizing that it takes so much energy and time that by the time you get to the evening gig, you're exhausted. I didn't quite understand all of that. So what happened is I went through and they interviewed me and everything was going fine. And they asked me, so you have a teaching certification, right? And I'm like, nope. Because performance degree, all my degrees are in saxophone performance. And so they started panicking because like finally found someone who wanted to do it. It was the school year had already started, and they look at me really seriously and they're like, "Do you think you could take an exam this weekend and pass it?" And I mean, I might have been a little cocky, but I'm pretty good at school. Like I understand how to take tests. I get that. That's just my way, the way my brain works. I'm not good at everything, but I'm pretty good at figuring that kind of stuff out. So I asked them, like, well, what's on the test? They go, well, there's music theory, there's music history, and then there's the history of education. I said, well, my history and my theory, I can definitely pass whatever you got. The education stuff, I've never studied it, I don't know. So I said, I think I can pass it. So they're like, okay. I took it that weekend, so 0 studying, and I passed it. But what that meant is that I had to take, even though I passed it, I had to take a whole series of education classes at the master's level at St. Peter's College, so that I could be certified to teach in the public school system of New Jersey. So that was the other kind of formal education I had. In terms of outside of the collegiate setting, I did spend time in Bordeaux, France, studying with Jean-Marie Londex, who's a very famous French classical saxophonist. I spent 2 weeks, and I'd go to his house like every other day or every third day. So it was just like a 2-week intensive, and it was amazing. I would play for him for like an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. We would then listen to music together and talk about different recordings, and he'd make me like homemade French fries. And we would just talk about art and music for another couple hours. It was an amazing experience. So there's a lot of ways that you can be learning in addition to, like, obviously I got a lot out of all the institutions I went to, but there's, I also got a lot of learning out of studying with people individually. So thanks for the question. Thanks for the interest. All right. Pranav, Happy New Year. Request a live session on how an orchestra works, how all the players' instruments are placed in a studio like Abbey Road's. What is the role of the conductor? All right. And Elton, I see you there. I was this close to doing the analysis of the love theme from Cinema Paradiso. I was actually listening to it yesterday. I saw the movie years ago and really enjoyed it. But I was re-listening to the soundtrack yesterday, and I forgot how much they use the saxophone in that score, and it's just beautiful music. So I was like, it almost happened. So hey, I'm glad you're hanging in with me. I'm going to get to that. But let's go to Pranav's question. And this might not be, I won't be able to give you a full answer to all of this, but I can certainly give you a shorter answer. So how does an orchestra set up? So if I'm looking at, let's say I'm the conductor, right? So if you're my audience, you see the back of my head. I'm going to be standing right here. I'm going to have violin 1s on my left, then violin 2 on like a soft left. I'm going to have my violas here, most likely. There's some variations on this, but this is kind of like one of the more common ones. Cellos will be on my right, and then often the basses will be behind them, like that. So violin 1, violin 2, viola, cello, basses. Then I'm probably going to have my first row of woodwinds. So I'm going to have my flutes, and there's usually 2. My 2 flutes, maybe my 2. And this kind of changes a little bit in terms of where exactly they go. I'm going to have my 2 oboe, my 2 bassoon. You notice the bassoon are placed over here close to the bass because they're in the lower side. So the higher pitched instruments are usually on the conductor's left, the audience's left. You might have your 2 clarinet in here as well. And then you're going to have your brass in the back. And the reason you put the brass in the back is they're so darn loud. So you need to get them a little farther away. So you might have, and this changes, but you might have something like French horn here. Actually, you probably have trumpets here. And probably French horn. And then probably trombones like so. So you have your back row of brass instruments. Sometimes these get broken up into 2 rows. So this is your woodwinds. This is your brass. And then you might have percussion, usually back here. The most kind of critical percussion instrument for more orchestral is the timpani, which is a low-pitched instrument. So you'll notice you have your low-pitched instruments kind of like all closer to each other so that they can listen and match in terms of tuning and precision. So percussion, primarily focused on timpani over here, and you might extend over like snare drum, crash cymbals. Your trombones, if you have a tuba would probably be over there. Bassoon, which is your woodwind, bass and cello in your string family, so strings right here. And so that's how that's kind of like the basic layout of your orchestra. And this is typical for both a recording session, like if you were going to record at Abbey Road, as well as live performances, whether you're have an orchestra at Carnegie Hall. There are variations, so don't get mad at me if you're like, wait a minute, that's not, there certainly are. And this is not my primary field of expertise, but when I conduct the orchestra, it's very similar to this. I have flute, oboe, and I put clarinet and bassoon in the second row. I put my French horn over here, so I'll just draw some arrows, right? So the bassoons move back here to so this is like row 1, row 2. I have my French horns over on this side, and then I go trumpet, trombone, tuba when I have it. So it's a very similar to this. Now, my role as the conductor, and is multi. So in a recording session or in the practice or in a performance, my job is to unify the musical interpretation. So in classical music, or in all music, right? When you have something supposed to be loud, well, the question is how loud. This is the critical question. How much, or how little? If someone says it's got to be loud, how loud? Soft, how soft? Composers aren't giving you decibel levels, and musicians aren't sitting there with their decibel meter being like, I'm playing at exactly the right decibel. So when we talk about volume and dynamics, it's a matter of how much. And the same is going to be true for things like articulation. So for dynamics, this question is critical. For articulation, someone marks in a staccato, meaning short. Well, how short? The general rule is half whatever that note value is. So if you see a quarter note with a staccato marking, essentially what that translates to is an eighth note with an eighth rest. That's essentially what it means. But it's not a hard science. That's a starting spot. You as the conductor have to make sure that everyone is doing that the same way, and that the way being chosen best captures the intent and emotion that the composer wanted, or that you think that piece is capable of. Because sometimes there's a piece of music that is capable of more than one interpretation, meaning there's more than one way, there's more than one flavor of emotion that piece is capable of presenting. So you can have, that's why you have different orchestral recordings, and people will argue which recording of Dvorak's New World Symphony is their favorite. And they're all like the same piece, but one might have some dynamics being a little bit louder than other, and so it gives it a slightly different feeling, or some might have slightly different articulation. And if we keep moving on from like what are the other how much, what about tempo, right? Sometimes a composer will say this should be 120 beats per minute, which is specific. That's like the equivalent of giving a decibel level. But usually you'll see things like allegro, which just means fast. And then the question is, well, how fast is fast? And so in a different tempo, what about if we change tempos? What if there's an accelerando or a ritardando? They want you to get faster. Well, how quickly should you get faster? They want you to slow down, a retardando, or a retard. How quickly should you do that? It's the role of the conductor to take all these variables and make sure that they come up with a unified musical interpretation. So apology for messy writing and spelling, okay? But this is the primary role of the conductor, a unified musical interpretation, answering how much for the dynamics, articulation, tempo, accelerandos, and a whole source of other things. And when we say, what does this mean, musical interpretation? What it means is, what is the emotion that you're going for? This is really what it's talking about. And so when people say, oh, I don't like classical music, it's kind of boring. There's a couple explanations for this. One is the person saying that might just not have enough familiarity with classical music to understand what's going on. So it might just be like, you know, if something's too complicated for you and you just don't understand it, you're going to get bored probably, right? You're like, I don't follow what's going on. I'm getting bored. So that's certainly possible. Another possibility is that the conductor did not do a good job, or the orchestra, or there was some problem between the orchestra and the conductor. Like, a conductor's telling, 50 people what to do. What if those 50 people are like, nah, we don't really like you. We're not going to really listen to what you're telling us to do. We know better, right? You could end up with an ununified musical interpretation, meaning that the emotion is not as powerful as it could be. So when people say, oh, classical music is boring, what they could be saying is that they understood what's going on, but the conductor and the orchestra did not do a very good job capturing a really powerful emotion with having the right answer to all of these questions. Like, if you make something too slow, that shouldn't be slow. Like, let's say there's a musical phrase that really, it should be slow, but if you make it too slow, it's boring. And if you make the wrong decision on how slow it should be, now all of a sudden you don't have a very emotional piece of music. Or the dynamics, right? It says to be loud, and you make it so loud that it's just like, it's off-putting. It's just like, oh, that's too much, right? Conductors can get it wrong. Conductors can have a bad relationship with their orchestra or an off day, and it doesn't come off. And then all of a sudden, the emotion's not there. So when people say classical music is boring, you gotta look a little deeper. Is it that the person just doesn't understand what's going on, and that it really is exciting music, and they're just not getting it? Or is it that this was not a very great recording and there was something missing? And it might be technically very good, but it missed the mark in terms of capturing the emotion. And I'll say that I've experienced that. I've experienced going and hearing elite professional orchestras, and they play everything and it sounds, all the notes are right, all the rhythms are right, and I'm bored. And I'll hear another orchestra, and they might have one or two wrong notes that I pick out, but it's super exciting. It's the same piece of music. How is that possible? Well, the one orchestra, even though it wasn't technically perfect, and I'll tell you which orchestra that was. It was Simon Rattle with the Birmingham Symphony. I heard him in Carnegie Hall. I heard a couple wrong notes, but the interpretation of all this stuff was so spot on. It was super, 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 super exciting. And I've heard other orchestras, which I will not name, professional, where they played all the notes right, but I was bored out of my mind. It looked like they were bored, and I was bored. So that's part of the role of the conductor. That's probably the most important one. Above and beyond that, part of it is getting to that unified. So having really good rehearsal technique. So how do you rehearse an orchestra such that you can get to that level where they're playing, like obviously the more right notes you play, the better chance you're going to capture the emotion. If you have one or two wrong notes, does that destroy the emotion? Probably not. Maybe. It depends on where those wrong notes happen, but probably not. So you do want technical perfection, That certainly helps get the emotion, but you need more than just that. You need the right answer to all of these questions. And so when you're rehearsing, you're trying to get to that, so there'll be a lot of stopping and starting to be like, oh, maybe a little softer. Oh, this should be a little, like, so you might see a conductor, they'll be conducting, and you might see them going like this, you a little softer, you a little bit more, right? And the way that they are conducting is trying to exemplify. So if you see these conductors, sometimes they look like maniacs, right? They're like this, but they're almost like actors. They're trying to embody the emotion they want the orchestra to convey. So if you say, I want this emotion, you're playing Beethoven, and you want this section, and then you're like, oh, I want this emotion. And so the conductors will embody that emotion in the way they conduct, the expression on their face, and that relays that information to the orchestra, and the orchestra then can kind of be like, oh, okay, we need to get this emotion. And that's the thing that I learned by playing with some fantastic musicians, a trumpet player by the name of Don Batchelder, and a clarinetist named Mitch Kriegler, and a pianist, Alison Franzetti Brewster. These were people, Brewster Franzetti, I think. These were musicians who didn't talk about, oh, this should be shorter, this should be faster. They talked about emotions. They're like, we think this section should feel like a day in spring where you've been locked up all day and you finally get to be outdoors. Let's play it like that. And so they would talk, and when we would rehearse, we would talk about things in that way as a scenario that would have the same emotion that we were going for. And then the assumption was we were good enough musicians to play the right dynamics, the right articulation, the right tempos to get that feeling out of the music. So the role of the conductor has that idea, as well as the rehearsal techniques necessary. That's really, really what's going to be primary elements. So I hope that answers your question, and I hope that sheds some light on all of that. So let's keep moving forward, and I just want to always jump back to the bottom because a number of months ago my battery ran out halfway through one of these videos, and I didn't even realize it. So the video kept running, but no one could hear what I was saying, and I was really into what I was saying, and it was very unfortunate that it didn't come through. Okay. So Elton Wild is asking, can I talk about application of counterpoint in contemporary music, both classical and popular? So I'm not 100% sure, but I think I have an idea of what you're asking. So counterpoint is awesome. Now, how much counterpoint people like is a matter of preference. I'm just remembering one thing. I'd like to go back for a second. When I was talking about when people say classical music is boring, that it could be that they don't understand it, that the conductor and orchestra didn't quite capture the emotion compellingly. It could also be that the emotion being expressed is being expressed perfectly fine, and the person understands it. They just don't like that emotion, right? So not everyone loves cat videos, but some people love them, and other people are like, cat videos? Like, I get it, but, right? So that's another permutation in terms of the complexity of like understanding how things work. So counterpoint. Let me start by going into a little bit of history. Johann Sebastian Bach versus George Friedrich Handel. These are both Baroque composers in the early 18th century. Bach used lots of counterpoint, and Handel uses some. And it's a matter of personal choice, preference, and it feels differently. The emotion is different. So when you listen to, what exactly is counterpoint? Counterpoint is where you have multiple melodies. And now what that means is that you have multiple things vying for your attention, for the listener's attention. Because if you want to keep it simple, one melody plus accompaniment. right? You got one melody, everything else is backup. A lot of Italian operas are one melody, and it's a gorgeous, beautiful melody, and very, very simple accompaniment to back it up, so that all your attention can be focused on that gorgeous melody sung by the diva singer, and that's your focus. As soon as you have more than one melody, there's more than one focus. There's more than one thing that's asking for your attention. Bach might have 4 melodies asking for your attention, and they're all weaving in and out of each other at the same time. And so sometimes this makes performing Bach very challenging. If the performers play each of those melodies as if they're all equally important the whole time, it can just feel overwhelming, and it can just feel like, instead of following things, it just feels like things are washing over you. And I remember thinking that some of Bach's music, counterpoint, was just not very enjoyable because it was so dense and it was so thick and you just couldn't follow it all. And then I heard Emanuel Ax, who was the pianist who played with Yo-Yo Ma, the famous cellist. And Emanuel Ax played a Bach piece on piano. And it blew my mind, because what he did is he would take this 4-voice counterpoint. And so voice 1, 2, 3, 4, and it would be like, let's say green is the one that's the most important melody. So it might be green here, and then all of a sudden this becomes the green melody, this green, then this green. And what happens is all the other ones are like secondary. Right? So what Emanuel Ax would do is he would make sure that this one is a little bit louder than the other 3, and then he would change and make this one a little bit louder, then this bass one, and then this tenor one. And the thing that's amazing is that that's the amount of control in your fingers, where you're playing, first off, to play 4 melodies with 2 hands. This means like your hand's like super flexible, right? And then to be able to say, like, for this, let's say 5 notes, this pinky and ring finger have to be playing louder than everything else, so that the listener hears that as the dominant melody. And then here, in this section, for these 8 notes, I got to make my thumb and my pointer finger of my right hand be the loudest. And so what he did is, instead of making it be a kaleidoscope, like a kaleidoscope of all the same intensity, he would bring out where the dominant melody, he would identify which one was the dominant melody, and then he would bring it out in his performance. And so that use of counterpoint, like if you're going to write it that densely, with that much intensity, you need a performer who's going to be able to identify, like step 1, the hardest part, which is the dominant melody of those 4, and then be able to bring it out. Handel was more of like, he would have counterpoint, so he would have his counterpoint was lighter. So he would have melody, 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 but when one melody was taking over, the other melody would just be super simple, or just not even anything, or almost accompaniment, right? So whereas Bach would, like, all of these would be like melody, melody, Handel would kind of have it become like super simple melody in the gaps. So you'd have, Alleluia, like Handel's Messiah. Bah, he is gate, go, ga, da, da, da. And so the melody would have like a nice long note, and then the other melody would jump in where you have the long note in a Handel thing. Whereas Bach would have just like not many long notes at all. So Handel's approach to counterpoint was a little easier to understand. And it was a little bit simpler. It's not saying bad. It's just it's different. It's a different vibe. So what's neat about counterpoint, in terms of it emotionally speaking, is if you think about teamwork, that feeling when you're like on a team, whether that's, let's say, you're playing soccer or football or badminton or whatever, where the team comes together and it works, there's like a certain unique feeling that happens, that like things are coming together. And I think counterpoint gives that kind of feeling as well. It's like, oh, look at how these two melodies are working together. Isn't that amazing? That feeling of seeing things work together, which we as human beings, we like that, right? It's part of our survival, especially early on in history. It's like if you don't work well with others, you're not going to catch the animal you need to eat, or whatever the case might be. So this counterpoint has this of like being able to hear how the melodies work together can be a really gratifying emotional experience for the listener. In terms of contemporary music, I always like to use examples from like the Beatles. So there's that song For No One, where it has the melody. I think Paul sings the melody, and then it has a French horn comes in and plays this kind of like counter melody, and then at the end of that, Paul sings the melody and the horn plays its counter melody at the same time. So it's like melody by Paul, melody by French horn, both together, and you're like, that's so cool. Like, because as you're listening to him, you're like, oh, that's a really nice melody. Thank you very much. Oh, listen to that nice French horn melody, and then you have no idea that they actually fit together. And so that's like a great moment in that song when you realize that those two melodies work together. So I think so, Elton, I hope that touches upon some of what you were asking, and kind of things for you to be aware of as you're listening to and analyzing music. I think the key takeaway in terms of what I'm saying is that the idea of counterpoint is to really get that feeling of that things work together, and that's a neat emotional thing to capture. And then that kind of that surprise value that some people like the Beatles, and George Martin, they were able to do, where it's like you hear two things and you don't realize that they can go together, and it gives it this whole other level. Great, let's keep moving. Here's another question. A simple trick that I find fascinating is the following progression over a C pedal. E, G, C, F, B flat, D. So let me see if I can, over a C pedal, you've got yeah. Pedals are, a pedal tone is such a wonderful thing, and it allows you to introduce dissonances in a way that the ear accepts and finds interesting and intriguing. So E, G, C, so I'm going to say C major triad with E in the bass, so this would be the right hand, and you're basically just going up, planing it up in whole steps. So like C major triad, D minor triad, E flat major triad. That looks like back down to D minor triad. Oh yeah, so you're just going back down. So you're going up, then you're going back down. All over a C pedal. Yeah, that's classic good stuff right there, right? So you're going. Right, and the thing that's interesting about that is diatonic, let's say you're C major, 2-chord diatonic, that's the flavor chord right there, that E flat major triad. Because you have the E natural here, then all of a sudden you have the E flat here. But your ear accepts it because it's hearing how it connects, right? You're hearing, and then you come right back down to it. So it almost sounds like a neighbor chord, a chromatic neighbor chord. Yeah, that's a great progression. That's a lot of fun to play with. Yeah, thanks for sharing. Life of Brian, good chord progression. Here's another one. Is it necessary for someone to learn Baroque repertoire if he's trying to be a jazz pianist? I love the Romantic era and 20th century, but not so much Baroque music. Happy New Year from Baghdad. So that's an excellent question. Your goal is to be a jazz pianist. Do you need to learn Baroque music? No, you don't. There's certainly examples of well-known jazz pianists who I'm sure did not know Baroque repertoire. I would be surprised if Count Basie knew Bach and Couperin, right? So if we're talking about like Francois Couperin wrote tons of, he's like a French, for harpsichord, tons of harpsichord music. You know, J.S. Bach, tons of stuff for clavier, which is essentially the same thing. I'm pretty sure Count Basie, and I could be wrong, but I would bet he didn't know a lot of this stuff. And I would, you know, and moving forward, did Wynton Kelly? Would Wynton Kelly know this stuff? Probably not. Probably not. So I think, even if I'm mistaken about these two, I'm sure there are some great jazz pianists out there who never learned Baroque repertoire. That said, there are people like Bill Evans who did, right? And I remember a story. This was when I was teaching in Jersey City, New Jersey. There was a vocal teacher there who played an early set at the Village Vanguard before Bill Evans came on. Bill Evans is the jazz pianist who played with Miles Davis and then went on with his own really famous trio. So, he plays some stuff and he goes up to Bill Evans. He goes, "So what did you think?" And Bill Evans goes like, "Play more Bach." like that was Bill Evans' advice to this guy I knew. His advice was play more Bach. This was jazz pianist talking to a jazz pianist. So, do you have to do it? No. You certainly can be successful without doing that. Are there certain advantages to doing it? Absolutely. The more you know, the better. So the question is, when you're talking here, you say, listen, you love the Romantic and 20th century, but you're not so much into Baroque music. Listen, I get that. If going back to my story a second ago where I was listening to the Bach's music and I was like, I don't really like it. And then I heard Emanuel Ax play it and I was like, oh, I get it now, right? Some of this stuff takes time, for a number of reasons. One, your understanding of Baroque music might expand and then you appreciate it more. Emotionally, the emotions that Baroque music are capturing might not really mesh with how you feel right now. So you're like, I'm not really into that. It feels too stuffy and too, rigid, right? There is certain aspects of that feeling to it. It's a different time, a different culture with different feelings and different priorities. Whereas the 19th century and the 20th century might be more emotionally sympathetic with you. But you know what? Your emotional landscape might change as years go by, and you might be like, you know what? I'm feeling Baroque music now. I can feel what they're feeling. I get it. Or it might just not be for you, which I think is fine. I think all of those options are possible. My as an educator, I'm kind of like my parents was when I was a kid. You got to try every vegetable. You got to at least try it before you say no, right? So if you've tried learning some of the Baroque repertoire and you're like, nah, it's not right for me at this time, I would say great. If you haven't even tried it once or twice, I think you should. I think there's a reason people like Bill Evans studied Bach and Baroque music. There's a reason why Bach and this music has survived, like whether you like it or not, the fact that it's survived over 200 years and people still, non-musicians still hear Bach, and Bach is being used by film producers and television executives. The fact that it's still around, points to that there's something there. And you should at least know what that something is before you decide that it's not for you. So that would be my advice. So Life of Brian saying it's like Dorian is being treated as an upper extension of the Mixolydian. Okay, I'm going to move forward and not tune in. Yes, Gabby. Yes, I hope you enjoyed your answer, and thanks for supporting me on Patreon. So, welcome. Danny Pippin is here. Thank you, Danny, and I appreciate you advertising and reminding everyone on our Facebook group. So, for those of you who haven't joined, there's a Dr. B Music Theory Facebook group, and Danny Pippin here does a great job at welcoming people, and we try to, if you have a question, unfortunately, I wish I had more time to answer everybody's question, every comment that's put on YouTube. I try to read as many as possible and respond to as many as I can, but sometimes I just don't have the time. But this Facebook group, we have a bunch of really good people like Danny who are going to do their best to answer your questions and give you some feedback. So feel free to look us up on Facebook, Dr. B Music Theory Facebook group. So Gabby's saying, yes, she meant different scale degrees, which is what I thought. And you're absolutely right, Gabby. You can chain the French and the German as long as they eventually resolve to your 5 chord, or 1-6-4, as the case might be. Either one is a possibility. Ron says, I thought this was supposed to start at 3 p.m. I went out to run errands, so it could be back at 3. Oh, Ron, I'm sorry. There was a bit of mix-up on the Facebook group where it was incorrectly posted at 3 p.m. It was just a mistake. So Ron, if you got a question, I'll be happy to answer it. Good news is this goes up on the channel. You can absolutely go back. I'm going to jump forward because if Ron's got a question, I'm going to bump him to the top of the list as an apology for the confusion. So I'll check in again. But Ron, I'm glad you were prioritizing trying to be here. I love having all of you watching. We got 29 people watching right now. That's not so bad. That's a good sized classroom for me. Most of my classes start out around at the beginning of the semester. I start out with about 26 people, and by the end of the semester, there's usually only like 13 or so left because it's an intense class, as you can imagine. For those of you who are loving it here, can you imagine like if you're not ready for the Dr. B intensity, it can be a lot. And the homework's a lot, which you guys don't have to deal with. Alrighty. All right, so I got James here. Happy New Year. Looking forward to another year of inspiration. Well, thank you. I'm happy to provide as much inspiration as possible. Carlos, happy New Year to you too. Appreciate it. Danny says, it feels like the German Augmented 6 and Italian Augmented 6 of 5 is a tritone sub for 5-7 of 5. So let's just write that out. Right? So 5-7 of 5. So 5, if we say we're in the key of C major, our 5 is G. Our 5-7 of 5 would be a D7. And then the Augmented 6 is an A flat with the F sharp, which again is kind of like an A flat 7. So it's kind of like a tritone sub. So yeah, in terms of the root, that aspect, in terms of the root and its motion to the G, that's certainly true. It's that this F sharp. So Danny, the thing that's different is that the F sharp goes up to the G, whereas the G flat of the tritone sub would go down to an F. So if this were a tritone sub, the G this would go down to an F, and it would be a 5-7 chord, a G7. That's the way it would work. But since it's an augmented 6 chord, instead the F sharp goes to a G, and it can be just a straight up 5 triad. So yeah, it does sound a little bit like a tritone sub of 5 of 5. Absolutely. So that's a good observation to make. All right. French Augmented 6 is Pranov's favorite. I'll give you a hint, it's my favorite too. I love the, for most things. It's so colorful and it's so, so. Right, and you get all, this stays as a common tone. It's just so, I'm trying to get better at trying to come up with an emotion for the things that I like. Like, what is that feeling? Because it's just like, it seems like a mystery excitement feeling. It's like mystery excitement. You know, it's like it has that almost like. That's why when I think of French Augmented 6, I think of Cirque du Soleil, like the French circuit. Like it's not. It's like it has a French feel. It's like I believe they're based out of Canada, but it has that kind of quirky, excitement, the unexpected. And I think the French Augmented 6 captures that very nicely. And I do like that. I like that level of excitement and mystery. So Gabby is saying, thanks a lot. That's exactly what I was hoping for, including using them as pivot chords. I love Augmented 6 madness. Good. I'm glad I answered everything. We got a question here from Ray. My AP Music Theory class loves watching material. Oh, that's awesome. Thanks, Ray. I've always thought, I mean, with all the craziness with the pandemic and teachers who are struggling to like offer their classes remotely, I was so happy I had all these things recorded for my own classes. And there's some teachers in my community that I sent a link to my YouTube channel. I said, listen, if this would be helpful to you in any way, you know, don't feel like you're stealing from me. This is out there. It's free. You know, use it. You know, I'm happy. So tell your AP Music Theory teacher, thanks for using my stuff. That's exactly what I was hoping would happen. I was like, I had no idea how useful it would be when I made these videos, but I'm really glad that there's people finding them useful and useful. And I think, especially when you're trying to do a bunch of stuff remote and online, man, boy, the grading has taken me way longer than it normally takes me. So if I was a music theory teacher and I had access to some videos that I could just share with my class, and then I could just focus on the grading and everything else, that would be wonderful. So I'm glad to hear that that's what's happening, Ray. All right. EMZ is saying hello to Dr. B and all musicians. Wants to wish everyone a happy new year and under a little snow in Quebec. All right. Emile, glad to have you. I love Quebec. Quebec City is beautiful. One of my favorite experiences is going to hear the fireworks competition right over the waterfall before it empties into the St. Lawrence. And it was the Italians, and they played like Puccini singing Nessun Dorma. So I have a very fond memories of visiting Quebec. So thank you for joining me. Okay. So Danny is saying here, also the N6 feels like a sub 5 that's just prolonging the dominant. However, I know in common practice, its function is that of the predominant family. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Let me just jot that out again, right? So N6, so if we're in the key of C major, we're talking about a D flat major triad with F in the bass. And it's going to go to 5, which would be a G chord. And so, again, you have this tritone relationship between the D flat and the G. And the reason that this tritone relationship works, and it works a little bit better when you actually deal with 7th chords. So if you were to break out, so let me just do it first as the triads. So D flat, F, A flat versus G, B, D. Well, these have 0 notes in common, right? So you're like, well, why are people talking about this tritone thing? What is it all about? If you just look at it in terms of the triads, there's nothing in common. You're like, what's going on here, right? So we're going from I think, so Danny, the way I hear this is if we're dealing with the triads, I definitely hear it as a predominant. And I know you're saying you hear it more as an expansion of 5. I hear it more as an expansion of 4, you know? So I hear this as going 1, 4, mystery 4, like super 4, right? It's getting magical, and then we get to 5. Ah, yes, 1, because that bass staying the same, and it's that voice leading of just those half steps makes me feel like that is an expansion of predominant going into dominant. However, where I would agree with you is if we expand this and let's say, even if this just turns into a 5/7, we get a little bit closer, right? Because now the F, we got an F in common with the N6 and the 5/7. So if we're going like this, right? We got that. Now all of a sudden that predominant and the dominant are a little closer together. They're a little more tied together. And if we abandon N6 as a concept altogether, I guess maybe not abandon it all the way, but let's say we added a C flat on top of this, and it really now turns into like a D flat 7. Now this C flat is common with the B. Now we've got even a closer connection between the two. So if we go, and I get that in there, right? So now I got, and I have to figure out a way to voice lead it right so that and so maybe I might leave out the A flat of the D flat 7. But the C flat, so if this ends up being, which is, then again, N6 normally doesn't add the C flat, because the emphasis on, because the emphasis is on this doubled F, right? You normally can't just easily put on a C flat into this and turn it into D flat 7. Once you do, then, Danny, I agree with you. It then starts to sound more like it's an expansion of the dominant as opposed to the predominant. So I think that's the way to look at it. Don't get too caught up in the tritone substitution idea. Remember, for tritone subs to really work, it's really the 3rd and the 7th being the same as the 3rd and the 7th being equivalent, right? So if D flat, F, A flat, C flat, it's not the tritone root relationship that's the most important thing. It's so this tritone relationship, that's not what's the most important. That's what gives it the color and the flavor. What's important is the equivalency of the 7ths and to the 3rds, right? So what was the 7 of the D flat, the 7th of the D flat becomes the 3rd of the G chord, and what's the 3rd of the D flat 7 becomes the 7th of the G7. That's what ties them together and makes them work. The tritone relationship of the root, that's the color, that's the flavor, that's the thing that gives it the spiciness and the excitement. But if you have a tritone relationship here, like N6 to a 5/7, there's just not enough of those things in common that you're really saying that it's really functioning like a tritone. The tritone relationship is almost something different than the tritone substitution, if that makes sense. The tritone substitution works because there's these two notes in common, the 3rd and 7th. A tritone relationship is usually something you avoid. The only reason it works and makes it spicy is because you have that connection. So differentiate between the tritone as an interval, which is a dissonant interval, and the tritone substitution, which has this commonality link. And I think that'll help you understand why N6 really, as a triad, going to a 5 triad, really belongs as a predominant, and the G would be the dominant. So that's how I would I would try to like frame that for you to think about. But that's a great question. All righty. All right. Ozcan999 is asking, can I explain first kind counterpoint rules, please? So I think when you say first kind, I think what you really mean is first species. I think that's the way most people are referring to. So you're really asking about first species counterpoint. Now, I'm not going to talk much about this because I did a video on first species counterpoint, so you can look that up. It's not in lesson 1 through 47. It's one of the ones after that. The basic idea is this is note against note counterpoint. So it's one note to one note. That's it. Then you go one note to one note. When you get to other species, you'll have two notes to one note, that relationship. But this is note against note. And what you'll do is you'll basically be analyzing these intervals. It'll be like 1, 3, 6, 5, etc., etc. So what you're going to do is that when you're looking at this, is what I talk about is making sure that your melodic line has a focal point, meaning a highest note, and that you have these intervals between the two voices, that they're the right kinds of intervals. You can't have too many 1s and 5s. You can't have too many perfect consonances because then it doesn't sound rich and sweet and smooth. And you need to have some though to make it feel like a resolution. So the 1s and the 5s will sound like your resolutions. The 3s and the 6s will sound sweet and pretty. And I have a whole video that's just totally dedicated to talking about this. I think it's actually a video and a half or maybe 2 videos on it, back to back. So just look those up. So instead of spending the time to go through that all again, I'm going to direct you to that. And if you have follow-up questions, tune in 2 weeks from today and ask me a specific question. And I love specific questions. I love it when people are like, these notes to these notes. That really allows me to focus in on answer the question. And if you have a specific question about a video, I love it when people put the exact time in the video where that question occurs. So if you say, okay, in lesson 42 at 12 minutes and 13 seconds, what did you mean? Can you re-explain that, what you said there? Like that allows me to really answer questions. So why don't you do that? And if you have any questions, you can put a comment in the video, or you can come here. Sometimes I don't get to read everything, but I do my best. So sorry I'm not getting to everything right now, but we got those videos. Okay. Jill was saying, super explanation of counterpoint and very comforting to hear you say how difficult it is to play 4 lines, especially bringing out a fugue subject at each entry. Oh yeah. So Jill, the easy part is the fugue entry, right? That's like, I mean, it's not easy. It's hard, but that's nothing to when you're like like you have these, you're doing a fugue, which is like a really common form from the Baroque era that Bach wrote lots of. You then have the episodes, and you have like the counterpoint connecting them. And when you're coming back and like the 4 voices have been going for a while, and you come back to your original subject, because that's what they call them in a fugue. So you have the subject and a counter subject. So if you're doing a fugue, and a fugue is a great form. It's really interesting. But let's say you have one voice comes in, and then let's say the soprano, and it's got the subject, and then let's say then it continues with the counter subject when, let's say, the tenor comes in, right? And the tenor is now playing the subject. you know, and then maybe the alto comes in and it's playing the subject, and then finally the bass, right? And so then eventually all four, and they have the subject and counter subject, and then this is going to counter subject when this comes in. You know, every voice gets the subject. Then you have all this like counterpoint, like a free counterpoint where it's like just bouncing off of each other. But then you'll come back, this is called the exposition, and you'll have essentially the exposition in another key. Right? So you'll kind of have it. It's at these spots in particular, and the free counterpoint, I find these to be the hardest spot to really bring it out. The exposition, it's like you're adding a new voice. That's the easiest. That's relatively easy. It's when you're in the dense of the thick of the free counterpoint, and when you're going back to those expositions to bring those out. That's the really challenge. And as a performer, especially in the free counterpoint in between these, I can't remember. I think these are called episodes. It's been a while since I've studied the exact terminology. It's in here where it's not even obvious. Like here, when you have the subject, it's obvious which is the most important one, right? It's the subject. But in the free counterpoint, you're always looking for, well, where's the subject? And if there is no subject for a period of time, what is the most important melody? And just even figuring that out is not always easy, because during Bach's time, they didn't use a lot of dynamics. So it wasn't like he would write forte under the one that's supposed to be the dominant one. And then, and then the other stuff, because it's all written for a keyboard. So that's the hard part. That's where being a good musician is critical. And this is why you'll have different interpretations of the same piece of music, and they can feel quite different. Because figuring out what's that dominant melody and bringing it out in these sections where there is no subject, that's the real artistry right there. Figuring that out, and when does it exactly change? And you have to use your ear as a musician, and you have to use some knowledge of history as well, just to kind of be like, well, what are the common practices? So you're right, Jill, that it's a real challenge, but it's a fun challenge. When I lived in Germany for a year, and I visited and spent a few days living in Trier, which is right on the border between Germany and France. And it was a city that, like, it was almost the entire city was pedestrian, so no cars, no electric wires. So unlike the United States, where we have all our electricity hanging on wires and poles, what's nice about that is when things go wrong or you want to upgrade stuff, it's really easy to do, but it's also really obvious. And in Trier, all the electric wires are like buried underground. So all you're seeing is a historic. You're basically seeing a city as it would have looked like when Bach was around. And I was hanging out with all these musicians who were trying to escape the draft from the Serbia-Croatian War. This is in the early 1990s. They're like, we don't want to get drafted into this war, so we're coming to Germany to escape that. And we would just hang out and we would just play jazz and talk about Bach. That was kind of like what we did. And I remember very clearly walking through Trier, and we were talking about Bach, and it had just started to snow ever so slightly, and I felt like I got like this chill over my body, and I was like, if Johann Sebastian Bach came around the corner just right now, it wouldn't faze me. I'd just be like, Guten Tag, Johann. I mean, it really, it really felt like I was in a time machine, and I was transported back to the Baroque era, talking with these musicians about Bach in this city that basically has looked the same for a couple centuries. So it was really, really wonderful. All right. Any recommended Bach excerpts for jazz bass student? Ooh, that's a great question. I don't know if I have a good answer for that. Here's what I recommend, and these are just so popular. Almost every instrument has played them, and I think it's a no-brainer for a jazz bassist. You need to do Bach's cello suites. Like if you're looking for things to play, Cello Suite #1. I mean, when I was as a saxophonist, when I had to do, this is one of the things, I did. There's all these people who've written out versions of Bach's Cello Suite for every instrument possible. Now, as a bass player, you're essentially the cello down the octave, so it should work great for your studies. Now, yeah, there's some double stops and there's some things that are a little bit different for sure. Obviously, they're different instruments with very different character, but boy, that would be a great exercise for you. And it's a nice. It has all these different. They're not. It's like a dance suite. So it's like different movements, but you'll have things like a courant, which will be a triple meter tempo. And I just recently did a video on dance suites. You'll have a jig. These are always tons of fun. And so it's just a whole series of these. So I would work on that as a jazz bass student. Try doing the Bach cello suites, and there's 6 of them. Start with #1 and see if you like that. I think that would be a great for your technique, because you have the whole opening one is like, it's like. So it's all these broken chords where you're taking a triad and arpeggiating it, but it's like 1 5 3 5 3 5. You get all. Right? So you get all these broken arpeggios in that first, I think it's the prelude. And I remember when I did this, I was like, I'm going to do this in a jazz setting. And so I would go through. So here's my task. I'll give you an assignment, all right? Since you asked me, this is Sarlula. Learn Bach Cello Suite, learn the prelude, and then apply that concept to all the things you are. So all the things you are is a Jerome Kern Broadway song that is very, very, Charlie Parker did versions of this, and this is a very common jazz tune. So all the things you are is. But treat it like a Bach Cello Suite. So instead of playing it like that, go. Right? And so don't make everything in root position like you would as a jazz musician, right? So that's your F minor chord, and just make it triads. Then you're going to go to B flat minor, so keep that F in the bass. Then you go to the E flat. Then to A flat, keep the E flat in the bass. So each voice is not moving a lot. So F minor 7, B flat minor 7, E flat 7, A flat major 7. That's your first 4 measures of all the things you are. What I'm saying is you play F minor, and you play B flat minor with F in the bass, then go to E flat major, and then go to A flat major with an E flat in the bass. So you're kind of keeping smooth voice leading a la Bach Cello Suite #1 prelude. That's what I used to love doing, that kind of stuff on the saxophone. And I think as a jazz musician, that's a great way to combine understanding Bach and voice leading with your jazz sensibilities. So give that a try, and let me know how that works. So we got another question. Luke S626 thanking me for my work. I appreciate it. Thank you. Do you think it's possible to learn and understand music theory at the age of 31 only by yourself without any prior background? Absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. So, child prodigies exist, right? There's certain careers that are, like, you're not going to be a child prodigy starting at the age of 31, right? The definition is like you've already missed that boat. But you absolutely can learn a ton about music, and I've actually known people who, got into music or got into some form of the arts There's no reason you can't. You know, so talent is important, right? And just, it's not like that talent disappeared in the first 31 years of your life. Like, whatever talent you have, it's still there. It's just never been nurtured. It's never been realized. The way you're going to learn at the age of 31 is going to have some differences than how you would have learned at the age of 3, 4, 5, 6, right? There's going to be certain things you're going to do a lot faster at the age of 31. Hopefully you've got some good learning skills and methodologies. So there's certain things you're going to learn a lot faster. And there's other things like, you know, little kids who will sit down and play the same thing over and over for like 2 hours without thinking about it. That might be harder for you. You might be like, oh, I'm getting bored playing the same thing over and over, right? So there's certain things that might come easier for you when you were 4, 5, or 6. But that doesn't mean you can't learn stuff. And absolutely, you know, if you've got that, because talent is, you know, talent is really, for most people, such a minor component to putting in the time with the right methodology, right? One of the reasons I do Dr. B Music Theory and do these videos is because I think I've come up with a really, really good method and way of learning music theory that's clear, simple, and effective, right? That's going to be true for learning anything in music, whether that's an instrument, your ear training, whatever it is you're learning. You want to find the best method possible to learn stuff, the most efficient way to learn something. You know, you could spend, you know, 20 years learning something, or you could spend 10 with a better method. You want to find out what those methods are, and that's what you want to use. And so you absolutely can learn. It's not too late at all to learn about music. It's not, you know, from what I've read, there's a window when you're young for perfect pitch to be established, and that's what sometimes kids, where they can hear pitches and know what letter it is, like looking at colors, right? I don't have perfect pitch. There's a lot of people say that, some people say you can develop that as an adult, other people say you can't. I don't know what the truth of the matter is. I think it's something that you can only learn as a kid. There's like that window where your brain will make those connections, even if that's, you know, so I think that's the case. Barring some of those things, you can learn everything you need at the age of 31 as well. So I would not let that hold you back. And there's just so much, like, I'm going to get on my soapbox for a second. When we talk about people living a good life, where, you know, because we know, and I think I've said this before, you know, we know there's people who, you know, are not happy, who are super discontented, and like sometimes so badly that they need to get prescription medications, and they need all these chemicals to try to even stuff out so they don't feel so horrible. You know, another thing that really helps, music. You know, I'm not saying take music instead of your prescription medication. I'm not saying that. Don't do that, right? I'm a doctor, but I'm not that kind of doctor, right? But I can guarantee you, music will help you. And so, and not only like listening to music will do certain good things for you, but performing music does a whole other set of things that have good results in terms of your emotional, how you feel, right? I work at a community college as well as Vassar College, and at the community college, I conduct an orchestra that's open to people of all ages. And we also have a chorus that's open to all ages. So we've got a lot of people who are in their 40s or 50s or 60s or 70s making music together. Let me tell you, it's a definite benefit to their life. Like, their life is better. They feel better because they're involved. Remember I was talking about a little bit ago about counterpoint and like teamwork and how that gives a certain feeling? Well, that's what performing really does. This sense of coming together as a team, of camaraderie, all that stuff. And the idea of the way the human brain has to work to kind of put the sounds together and make sense of them. It's one of the few things where your brain will do the work without you necessarily being aware of it, and so you'll have this sense of accomplishment in a way that doesn't happen in other art forms. And I love all the other art forms. I'm not saying music is better. I'm just saying it's different. and it's different in a way that really works well for emotions, which is why you'll find these crazy cases of someone who's like had some brain trauma and they can't talk anymore, but they can sing a song. So I would not let age 31 stop you from getting started on getting the benefits of being involved with music. I think they're just so massive. You know, I'm not talking about having a career. I'm saying just being involved with music. And one of the things that I really liked when I was living in Germany is how many lawyers, doctors, pharmacists, shopkeepers would take out their instrument on the weekend and play in a community orchestra. There were so many community orchestras. I love the country I live in. I think America has a lot of great things going on, but other countries have great things going on too. And that's one thing that they do better than we do, community orchestras and community music making. That emphasis that I found when I was living in Germany on amateur music making and how many people, the percentage of the population that was involved in that, I was impressed by, and I thought it was very beneficial for the community. So I hope that's a long-winded answer for you, but I hope that gives you something to think about. Barefoot 67 just found the channel. Yeah, start with lesson 1, keep going. There's so much stuff, great videos here, so you're in for a treat, I hope. Pranav, do all the rules of harmony or anything in music, does it apply to film music from perspective of screen scoring? Yeah, all the rules apply. Absolutely. All the rules apply that we're learning do apply to film scoring, but film scoring has it's like all the rules that we are learning apply, but they also have additional rules that are different than what we've been talking about. So when you're filming for a score, and what's nice, what I love about doing these Q&As, right? I don't know what questions you guys are going to ask me. Are you going to ask me something I know about? Are you going to ask me something I don't know about? I mean, I don't know everything about music. I'm trying, but I'm not there. I never will be, right? But I'm going to keep learning. But the connections are amazing. So when we were talking about counterpoint and how counterpoint, as soon as you have more than one melody, it's two things that are both competing for your attention. With film music, we're not talking about just music. We're talking about a combined art form. We're combining art forms. Just like a song is not just music. It's music plus poetry, or whatever we want to call the lyrics, right? Songs are a combination of art forms. You can have music all by itself, just instrumental music. You can have poetry all by itself. When you put them together, you get a song. Film is combining so many art forms, right? This is so many art forms involved in film. The art of music is just one of those aspects. Because of that, you have so many things that are asking for your attention, right? And so when you start talking about film music, you have to be really careful that the music doesn't demand too much of the audience's attention, which is why you'll notice that the big song, let's say, the big musical section might happen during like a chase scene. It's probably not happening during the dialogue, right? Because it might be too distracting. If it is, there's something really passionate going on, right? If it's going on under the dialogue. So in film music, there's the parts where the music gets to shine, like in a chase scene. Then there's underscoring. This is usually what's happening when there's dialogue going on. Think about it. This is where studying opera comes into play. Think about it like opera to film. There's an obvious connection, right? And so underscoring is kind of like recitative, where it's just kind of light music to kind of keep a mood. So with film music, because you want to make sure that the music is not taking too much of the attention, you'll have things that it'll be more like ambiance. Music will serve more of an ambiance, or you'll have far, far more repetitive music than you would expect So like in film music, like so sometimes like Philip Glass, he's a more contemporary classical composer known for minimalism. Minimalism basically means that there's a ton of repetition. So you might hear this might go on for a long time, and it's just setting a mood. It's setting the ambiance, right? It's almost like partial music. It's not full-on music. It's just the harmony and some rhythm. It doesn't actually have a melody sometimes, and that's okay, right? It's setting the mood. And the repetition allows the listener to absorb the mood and then focus in on whatever the dialogue is or whatever is happening from the visual side of things. So there are some different rules when it comes to film music that allow you to kind of like have almost like partial music where you can have more repetition, you can have like almost an absence of a melody altogether. All of those things work because of the level of attention you want to be getting. And one of the biggest mistakes when students start writing film music is they write far too interesting melodies with not enough repetition, and it's competing with it's too much. It's competing with what's going on in the story. So next time you watch a movie, pay attention to the music and ask yourself, when is the music kind of just setting the ambiance and the mood, and when is it like a full-fledged piece of music with its own like distinct, powerful melody and progressions. So when you think about what rules might be kind of like exempt for a while. So the idea of progression, which is something we talk a lot about, the rules of like, we expect a 3 chord to go to a 6 chord, to a 2 chord, to a 5 chord. Like, that's not as important if we're not trying to grab people's attention. The idea of a progression of a goal, it's like, no, we're just setting a mood. We're not really trying to get to the goal. We're setting a mood. So I think that's how you would think of film music as differently. Speaking of film music, I'm going to make a plug for a new Pixar movie. Animated. It's a movie called Soul. I just had to renew the subscription to Disney Plus because I wanted to see this. It's about a jazz musician, and as a person who loves jazz, and I was listening to it, watching this film, and I was thinking, man, the music is really good here. Like sometimes I watch films and I get really like upset. Like so, I was watching Little Women, the most recent version from last year, and they have this scene where they're dancing to Antonin Dvorak's American Quartet. So here's the problem. This is why I think I should be a music consultant for films. Like Little Women, this is a big production. They've got like big budget, right? And I don't know if they did this on purpose. I don't think they should have. But if they didn't do it on purpose, they should definitely know, right? So Little Women is set like the Civil War, American Civil War. So like we're talking 1860s. And at a part, they're dancing to Dvorak String Quartet, which is from 1893. Now, it's not that I'm a history snob that's like, oh, it's not correct. It's, like, that's not my problem. My problem is that 1860 was very different culturally than 1893. It felt different. The emotions were different. What people thought were important was different. It's different than 30 years later. It's very, very different, that feeling. So it's like pretending, it's like having, like, it would be like doing a movie of Bach where Bach is like, yo, dude, what's up? That's just not at all the way that time period would have functioned. And I'm okay with doing things that are historically inaccurate. You just have to have a really good reason for doing it. I don't think Little Women had a compelling reason to change the way this time period felt with something that was 30 years in the future. That culture just feels differently. What I loved about Soul is the music totally worked. And so I watched the credits and I looked, they had a list of music consultants. And their list of music consultants were a who's who of amazing jazz musicians. Like one of those people was Herbie Hancock, who's, you know, you don't get any more elite as a jazz musician than someone like Herbie Hancock. And so the music, the way the music was incorporated, and it's not a movie, it's not a jazz movie, it's just the character was a jazz musician, and it's a completely entertaining story, but there's some scenes with some jazz, and every time that happens, I'm like, that sounds great. Oh yeah, that works. That's the way it would be. It just, you know, and so when you're making a movie, and this is, I think, one of the things Pixar is known for, is they really research everything they're going to do their film on, and they hire amazing music consultants like Herbie Hancock and other great jazz musicians to make sure they get it right. And so that's, you know, that's kind of my and I enjoyed Little Women, don't get me wrong, but I just really thought that was a mistake, musically speaking. That was a mistake. Whereas Pixar Soul did not make any of those mistakes. So folks, I know there's a lot of questions left. I apologize. It's been an hour and a half. Oh no, it's been 2.5 hours. It's been 2.5 hours. And I think this is I like to leave it here on a nice culminating. It was a great question about film music, and here I got 2 films, one that I'm going to praise for their musical treatment, and one that I'm going to give a critique for. And I think that's a great place to leave it. And I think you should all watch Soul if you haven't already. You guys love music. I think you'll enjoy it. You'll find it entertaining. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to be back in 2 weeks at 1 p.m. 1 p.m. And so hope you can join me there. And for all of you who are still watching some of my other videos, enjoy. Happy New Year 2021. Let's learn a lot about music. Take care.